So David twice, verse 1 and verse 3. Verse 3, he asks the question to Ziba, Saul's servant. Is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness? Sparing restoration of the family member of an enemy develops around the fact that David and not Mephibosheth took the initiative. David's desire, David's endeavor is to show the kindness of God to the family of his enemy. Then notice the moving cause of David's desire. Again, his desire is to show the kindness of God to a family member of an archenemy. Why? For Jonathan's sake. Verse 1. For Jonathan's sake. He wanted to show kindness to a member of Saul's family. Not because of any merit in Saul, not because of any merit in anyone else, but simply for Jonathan's sake. That's where the merit is, for Jonathan's sake. The king wants to show kindness to a member of his enemy's family on the account of Jonathan. Not on the account of Mephibosheth, but in the account of Jonathan, which of course was Saul's son, who had protected David from Saul in 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 through 4. 1 Samuel 20, we see that Jonathan and David had entered into a covenant. This was long before Mephibosheth was born. They entered into a covenant, and David swore that he would show kindness unto Saul's house on account of Jonathan. So David desires to show the kindness of God unto any possible survivors of Saul's house, not because they were deserving, not because they were worthy, but because Jonathan was worthy. Because Jonathan was worthy. For Jonathan's sake. That is, in behalf of the interests of Jonathan. David is saying, I want to show kindness unto a family member in the behalf of the interests of Jonathan. For you and I that are saved, putting ourselves into this account, God desired to save our souls. He desired to bestow his love, his grace, his mercy, his kindness. But there was absolutely no reason in you and I. There was no merit in you and I. But he would do so based upon the merit of Jesus Christ. God in time would show us his saving kindness. Again, not because of us, but because of Jesus. So now let's look at the object of David's desire. He's not anything special. Neither were we. In our text, in verses 2 and 3, David called Ziba. He was a former servant of Saul. And he asked him, Is there not yet any of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God unto him? Ziba proceeded to tell the king of a son of Jonathan. The son's name was Mephibosheth. We're told that in verse 6. The name means a shameful thing. Jonathan has a son, but he's a shameful thing. That accurately describes the nature of man. Isaiah 64:6, we are all as an unclean thing, thoroughly polluted by the filth and dominion of sin. What we are by nature is set forth very plainly throughout the Word of God, but very plainly in Romans chapter 3. In verse 9, we see that we're all under sin. That says more than we've all sinned. We're all under sin. We're under the control of sin. Romans 3 verse 10, there is none righteous. Then for emphasis' sake, no, not one. In Romans 3 verse 11, there is none that understandeth. There is none that seeketh after God. Romans 3:12, they are all gone out of the way, and they are together become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, again for emphasis, no, not one. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Thoroughly depraved, thoroughly corrupt. Man by nature is Mephibosheth, a shameful thing. But the account goes beyond the actual account to ourselves. We were Mephibosheth. We were a shameful thing. But just as David desired to show Mephibosheth the kindness of God for Jonathan's sake, so God desired to show you and I his kindness. All because of Jonathan. All because of Jesus. Mephibosheth, like you and I, was a member of a destitute, disgraced, and doomed family. He belonged to the family of Saul, the archenemy of David, the king. And David would have been justified in putting any of the offspring of Saul to death. The man by nature is Mephibosheth, belonging to a family at enmity with God. Due to our lineage from Adam, we were deserving of God's condemnation. God's judgment. We read in Romans 5:10 that we were enemies. We were the foes and adversaries of God. And again in our text, the account goes beyond the actual account to ourselves. We were Mephibosheth. If you're unsaved, you are Mephibosheth. An enemy of God, under the curse of a broken law, subject to the wrath of the lawgiver. We read in Ephesians 2 verse 3, we were by nature the children of wrath. Before we did anything, we were by nature the children of wrath. John 3 verse 18, we're condemned already. Cursed. You don't have to commit a sin. You will and you do. But before you even committed a sin, you're already condemned. Simply because of who you were by nature. We, like Mephibosheth, were under the wrath of the king. And we were fully deserving of such. But just as David desired to show Mephibosheth the kindness of God for Jonathan's sake, so God desired to show you and I his kindness on account of Jesus. Also notice that Mephibosheth was a fugitive from David. We learn from 2 Samuel 4 and verse 4 that when Mephibosheth was 5 years old, news came of Saul and Jonathan's death and David's ascension to the throne. So the nurse of Mephibosheth takes up Mephibosheth and flees in terror. They were afraid. Who are they afraid of? David. They were afraid of David. And what are they doing? They're seeking to get out of his way. They're seeking to stay out of his way. And so it is with the unsaved sinner. Whether they know it or not, they flee in terror from the God of the Bible. And just as Mephibosheth was seeking to get away from David, so you and I were. We were seeking to get away from God. Just as Mephibosheth wanted nothing to do with David, you and I wanted nothing to do with the God of the Bible. It was while in this state that David desired to show us the kindness of God on account of Jesus. Now we read in our text that Mephibosheth was a crippled. He was lame on his feet. And we're told how that came about. It came about through a fall. Ziba, again, David's question is there yet any of the house of Saul? Ziba answers, Jonathan has a son, which is lame on his feet. Ziba has a son that's lame on his feet. Ziba is saying, Jonathan has a son, but he's broken. He's broken. It is stated in verse 13 that he was lame or disabled, impaired on both his feet. In 2 Samuel 4 verse 4, we read again that when Mephibosheth's father Jonathan and grandfather Saul were killed in battle, and Mephibosheth's nurse realized that the 5-year-old Mephibosheth he's heir to the throne. His life's in danger. David's going to kill him. I mean, that's the logical conclusion. So she grabs Mephibosheth. And she ran in panic. And we read that there was a fall. Tripped and fell. And Mephibosheth was broken as a result of a fall. Everyone enters this life broken. Broken. Disabled. Broken for life. The spiritual parallel, of course, of this fall of Mephibosheth is obvious. Man has suffered a fall that has left him a spiritual cripple, permanently damaged by a fall. He was lame on both his feet. That speaks of his inability. It's a picture of our own spiritual inability. We're unable to come to God. We're unable to walk in His ways. You hear Jesus say in John 6:44, no man can come to me. No man can. It's not just that he won't, but he can't. No man can come except the Father which sent me. Romans 3 verse 11, there's none that seeketh after God. Mephibosheth could not come. And Mephibosheth would not come to David. And I was Mephibosheth. But it was while in that condition that God desired to show me His kindness, not due to any merit of our own, but because of Jesus. Then consider the place where Mephibosheth resided. Again, David had asked Ziba, is there yet any of the house of Saul that I may show him the kindness of God? Ziba proceeds to tell David of Jonathan's son Mephibosheth that he was lame on his feet. How did David respond to that? Yes, David, Jonathan has a son, but he's broken. He's not going to be of any use to you. David did not ask, how lame is he? How crippled is he? David did not respond with any questions about Mephibosheth's condition. Because no matter how bad his condition was, it was not a deterrent to David. David's response in verse 4 is simply this. Where is he? David, he's broken. Where is he? Where is he? Ziba answers, he's in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lodabar. He's down in Lodabar, a city east of the Jordan River, in northern Palestine. The name Lodabar means the place of no pasture. So it is a place of barrenness. It's a place of wastelands. It's a place of devastation. It's basically in the midst of the wilderness. It's a place of desolation. It's a place of exile. It's a place of bondage, destruction. It's a place of shame. It's a place of helplessness. It's a place of fear. So there's Mephibosheth, a shameful man, belonging to a disgraced and doomed family, a fugitive from the king, And he has a severe disability. And he's living in desolation. And the truth is, he's quite content to remain there, away from David. He's quite content to spend his remaining days in Lodabar. I was Mephibosheth. Like him, I lived in the land of barrenness, waste, and devastation, and quite content to remain there, away from God. And even if I wanted to leave there, I could not, because I was a spiritual cripple. And that brings us to David makes provision for Mephibosheth. So there's David. He's the king. He's on the throne. He has a purpose of heart to show kindness unto Mephibosheth for Jonathan's sake. But there was this enormous obstacle. Mephibosheth belonged to a rebellious family. And Mephibosheth was afraid of David. And Mephibosheth was hiding from David. And Mephibosheth would not come to David, even if he wanted to come. He never could on his own. He was unable to do so. I was Mephibosheth. But David makes provision to bring Mephibosheth from Lodabar to himself. Again, due to a covenant that David and Jonathan entered into before Mephibosheth was born. Mephibosheth knows nothing of this covenant. I knew nothing, and you didn't either, of this covenant. David is purposed to show kindness to Mephibosheth for Jonathan's sake. David now knows where he is. So what's David going to do? Is he going to just sit back and hope that one day Mephibosheth would stop being afraid of him? Maybe someday somebody would talk to Mephibosheth and convince him that you don't need to be afraid of David. And one day he would just come to the realization that I'm going to stop hiding from David and I'm going to go to David. Is David going to sit back and wait for that? No. Verse 5. Then, after he hears that he's in Lodabar, then David sent someone down to Lodabar and fetched him out from Lodabar. So David did not just merely send to Mephibosheth an offering. He didn't just send a servant down to Lodabar and say, Mephibosheth, if you would come to David, he will show you kindness. He didn't send Mephibosheth an offering and then leave it to the will of Mephibosheth. He didn't just send an invitation to Mephibosheth to come. It says that he sent and fetched him out from Lodabar. Had he not fetched him, Mephibosheth would have died in Lodabar. But he sent and fetched him from Lodabar. He didn't just offer Mephibosheth assistance. He did not send Mephibosheth a pair of crutches and say, Mephibosheth, do the best you can, then make your way from Lodabar to me. No, he sent and fetched him from Lodabar. I was Mephibosheth. If you're here and saved, you were Mephibosheth. David would have been just in killing Mephibosheth. But instead, he purposed to spare him. So it is God purposed to spare us. And he didn't just sit back and hope that we would come to him. And he did not just merely make us an offer. And he did not just merely assist us. No, he sent the Holy Spirit. Where we were living afar off from him, living as a fugitive, helpless in the land of waste and destruction. And he fetched us. And had he not done so, we'd still be in Lodabar. No man can come to me except the Father which hath sent me draw him. And that is exactly what happened in our salvation. So Mephibosheth is brought into the presence of David and blessed abundantly. Now notice verse 6. Now when, that's a very definite time. Now when Mephibosheth was come unto David. But we know from reading the previous verses, they didn't come of his own. Is it true that he came unto David? Yes, it is. Did you and I come unto Christ? Yes, we did. But did we do so on our own will and our own effort? No, we did not. We came because we were fetched. Big difference. So there was a definite time in which it could be said that Mephibosheth was come unto David. For all who are saved, there was a definite time which it could be said that we came. That we came. But it was the result of David taking the initiative to fetch him. And so it is with us. It's the result of God. So he's been brought out of Lodabar, the place of no pasture. Mephibosheth believes that he's about to lose his life. So he falls down before the king in verse 6. And there he is, trembling. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he said what is recorded in verse 7. And you read verse 7. There was no contingency. There were no bargains made. There were no conditions stipulated. It was simply, I will surely show thee kindness. Why? For Jonathan's sake. It was grace and mercy. Pure and simple. Not only was his life spared, but there was peace for Mephibosheth, verse 7. Fear not. Fear not. For I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake. So his life was spared. There was peace. There was also an inheritance for Mephibosheth. Verse 7, and will restore unto thee all the land of Saul thy father. He didn't just say, Mephibosheth, I'm going to spare your life, now go back to Lodabar. No. It was, I'm going to restore unto thee all the land of Saul, thy father. That was repeated in verse 9. So Mephibosheth had restored to him the forfeited inheritance. The heritage which belonged to Saul had been lost to his family. Mephibosheth couldn't do a thing to regain it. But David, for Jonathan's sake, restored the inheritance unto Mephibosheth. You and I lost paradise life in Adam. But God has provided restoration for Jesus' sake. For Jesus' sake. We see also there was a portion granted to Mephibosheth in verse 7. Thou shalt eat at my table continually. And that is stated 4 times in the text. We see it in verse 7. We see it again in verse 12. Verse 10. But Mephibosheth, thy master's son, shall eat bread always at my table. We see it again in verse 11. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table as one of the king's sons. And it is stated again in verse 13, for he did eat continually at the king's table. 4 times it is stated that Mephibosheth would eat at the king's table. What a contrast from being an outcast in Lodabar. From the place of no pasture to feasting at the king's table. Notice also there was a special position for Mephibosheth in verse 11. Listen to David as he says, he shall eat at my table as one of the king's sons. Not as one of the servants, but as one of the sons. So there sits Mephibosheth, once part of a disgraced and doomed family. But he's been fetched out of a life of bareness. He's been fetched out of a life of waste and exile and shame and fear. And now he sits as the son of a king, as a member of the royal family at the king's table. That's you and I that are saved. In Lodabar, why would you ever want to go back to Lodabar? Yet God's people do it all the time. They go back to Lodabar. Why would you even want to go back there to visit? Back in Lodabar's bareness. You've got a spot at the king's table. Why would you go back to the land of bareness? To the land of waste? The land of desolation and confusion and helplessness and hopelessness. That's not where we live. We lived there once, but that's not where we're to live. How sad. When God's people go back to Lodabar, and they marry in Lodabar, they raise their kids in Lodabar, and eventually they die in Lodabar. What a shame. Wouldn't you much rather spend your remaining days sitting at the king's table? He hath raised us up to sit in the heavenlies. We have a position at the king's table. No matter what a day may bring forth, because we've been fetched out of Lodabar for Jesus' sake, we can sit at the King's table. No matter how difficult and trying the way, no matter what the obstacles, no matter what the troubles, no matter what the trials, no matter what the burdens, no matter what the strain, no matter what the stress, I can live at the King's table as his child. Why would I be so foolish to go back to Lodabar? At the King's table, there is the provision of the King. In Lodabar, there's nothing. But at the King's table is the provision of the King. God's people go back to Lodabar. Pray for me, they'll say. I'm depressed. Well, I wonder why. Pray for me, I'm just not happy. Well, I wonder why. Are you so foolish to think that you're going to find happiness and fulfillment in Lodabar? You can sit at the King's table and enjoy the provision of the King. At the King's table, there's plenty. At the King's table, there's refreshment. At the King's table, there is sweet fellowship. Sitting at the King's table with the King, with the family of the King, that's palace living. No, I would much rather have palace living than Lodabar living. Everything that I need to sustain me today, I can find at the King's table. Everything that I need to strengthen and encourage me, I can find at the King's table. I will not find it down in Lodabar. In the midst of disappointment and distraction, we can find contentment at the King's table. So you look at Mephibosheth, and there he sits at the King's table as one of the King's sons. And isn't it wonderful to be able to say, I am Mephibosheth. I am Mephibosheth. Now the passage closes with the fact that he was still lame when it opened his feet. And as Mephibosheth would try to walk, he was reminded of the grace, the kindness of David. You and I still have the effects of Adam in our lives. And they ought to serve as a reminder of the King's grace for us. We're still broken to some degree. But God's been gracious. And we can sit at the King's table. And as Mephibosheth sat at the King's table, no one noticed his lame, crippled legs. Those are under the table. Isn't life much better at the King's table than Lodabar? And I would still be living in Lodabar, and I would die in Lodabar, were it not for the fact that one day the Lord came and fetched me out of Lodabar. He is to get all the glory, all the honor. I'm just the blessed recipient of his kindness. Brother Ben, if you come and lead us in verse